based on the controversy surrounding the racial identity of the Moors and other North Africans like the Egyptians. There tends to be an erroneous belief that any and everything in Africa automatically means black. The entire landmass was a land entirely inhabited by people of black skin, and that anyone who doesn't fit that phenotype is a recent foreign invader. I think
while he is correct that some people of Africa back then who came from the Middle East came into Africa and possibly into North Africa and even East Africa, was it the majority or was it a small population? That's the real question. Not is everyone black in Africa. And worse than this is I've noticed that only Africa suffers from this problem of purity, because the Middle East, we know, has had Africans go there. It's had Europeans go there in the form of Indo-Europeans. It's had Asians go there in the form of the Han, the Chinese Genghis Khan people. But yet the population still remains as one unit, unquestioned. This is actually strange to me, considering the fact that in Africa, if you have any mix, you're considered different.
this argument is primarily fueled by the fact that here in the United States, African diaspora are referred to as African American, unlike other groups of people who are usually referred to by their respective country rather than their continent.
This argument is highly flawed because even people of Europe are not the same race just by staring at them. In fact, I would say that the people of Europe have a diversity. So the people of Africa obviously have a diversity if you just calculate the people that would be the black Africans. So for example, the Niger people, the Congo people, the Sudanese people, and the Ethiopians, it's obvious there that there's a diversity. But if you look at Scandinavians, Italians, Iberians and Celto-Iberians, you will notice that they are different from one another. They're not identical. Now, to take this even further, the Romans actually wrote about the different races in Europe, and this is what they had to say. Fashioned with their own particular complexion, and each stamps with a character of its own, the like nature and anatomy of the human body, which all share. Germany, towering high with tall offspring, is blonde. Gaul is tinged to a less degree with a near-related redness. Hardier Spain breeds close-knit sturdy limbs. The father of the city endows the Romans with the features of Mars and Venus, joining the war god, fashions them with well-proportioned limbs, and quick-witted Greece proclaims in the tanned faces of its people the gymnasium, the manly wrestling schools. Curly hair about the temples betray the Syrians. The Ethiopians stain the world and depict a race of men steeped in darkness. Less sunburnt are the natives of India. And as we can see at the bottom, it says, the sun god dries up with dust the tribes of Africans amid their desert lands. The Moors derive their name from the faces, and their identity is proclaimed by the color of their skins.
For example, Chinese American, or Mexican American, or German American. In addition to this, black people are not African American. Despite where our ancestors may have come from, we're still Americans. I mean, you don't see people going around calling white people European Americans. They're usually just called white or American. With that said, people in the United States, regardless of race, tend to erroneously view African people and their history from a Pan-African perspective, and that all of its people are one and the same, all collectively part of the history of Black Americans, or African Americans.
To pretend like this is coming out of nowhere, like there is no proof. What I just read to you, the thing about the Ethiopians stain the world, and that the Moors are given their name because of the darkness of their skin, that's not coming out of nowhere. That's like written down. And also the idea that the people who lived in Africa at one point were all black is a fact. You just have to look at the time frame. Of course, there were people who came from the Middle East at some point that came in, but it is a fact that at one point they were black African and they came from the Middle East and changed the races. Now, if you believe that they came 10,000 years ago, others believe they came 4,000 years ago, and some believe that they came more recently. I believe that, of course, there were some populations of Middle Eastern people who came far back. I don't even know how long. But I also believe that more and more and more and more people from the Middle East kept coming in.
On the other side of the argument, there are those people who believe that North African peoples were utterly and exclusively non-black peoples, and that any attempt to say otherwise is just an Afrocentric attempt at claiming other civilizations as your own. Despite the fact that I was very clear about Moors not belonging to one particular race, I constantly got accused of blackwashing and whitewashing their history all at the same time by different people. What this shows me is that some people are so obsessed with their own racial self-esteem that prior to clicking the video, they already have it made up in their mind that if I don't exclusively state that the Moors belong to their particular race, or in the case of the white racist, the only criteria is to disassociate Moors from blacks completely, then it's not good enough and I'm appropriating their people and their history to a different race than what it belongs to.
So, the Africans who come into the Middle East change the racial identity of the Egyptians or the North Africans. Therefore, North Africans are not black. What about the Middle Easterners that got into Europe and introduced farming? What about the Middle Easterners that got into Europe and changed the demographics of Spain? What about the Middle Easterners that changed the demographics of the entirety of Europe through the farming eras? Or what about the Indo-Europeans who changed the demographics of Asia? How do they remain one race when we know that farming, I mean, we're talking about thousands of years back in Europe, there were people from the Middle East coming in and they changed the demographics, but somehow they're not mixed. They're one group, they're white people.
In the video, I made it very, very clear that Moors are a very diverse group of people and that it is simply illogical to put them into one single westernized racial category.
A genetic study was done to study the difference between the African Berbers and the Arab speaking populations, and they found no difference whatsoever between the Arab speakers and the Berber populations. And what of the Italians? Do you really think that the Italians and the Greeks and people from Turkey and those areas look the same as other Europeans? I mean, take a look at them. Does this woman look to you like a Scandinavian? Does she look like a Celtic? Does she look like any of those other groups? If your answer is yes, then I have fooled you, because these people are actually Persian. They're not from Italy or Greece or any part of Europe. And of course, in Persia and other parts of the Middle East, the people look like Italians. And I will show real Italians now. As you can see, these people in type are the same or similar. They have dark hair, longer heads than most Europeans, and they have thicker lips than most Europeans. They're not thick lips, but they're thicker than most Europeans. And in this fact, they also have brown skin that can tan better than most Europeans. These Italians have also genetic diversity due to the fact that Europeans have been moving into different areas since the time of the Romans. And this was written down by the Romans, as I had shown you in the previous one. Blonde was virtually unknowable or unknown in Greece and places like that until they brought slaves and other people from those regions.
Asking this question is similar to asking the race of an American.
This point about Americans not being able to identify their race is going against everything that he just said, because America's race thing, where they are multiple races, is something that happened in a very small amount of time, which he's going against by saying that the Berbers took a long time to get to where they are. This is not the same argument at all.
They are a combination of races that could be as white as Europeans or as black as sub-Saharan Africans. The majority of them, however, were completely indigenous to North Africa and would look something similar to most of North Africa's population today.
Saying that the Amazigh people or the Berbers are completely native to Africa is a lie. And I know this because the Berbers are said to have come from the Middle East from 10,000 years ago or something like that. Even in the most charitable sense that I can extend to you, it's not true that the Berbers are pure Africans.
Which would be a medium brown people who are neither black or white, or even Arab for that matter.
This word Arab is confusing the conversation. I would say that they are a Middle Eastern type, and that's just a fact.
So now allow me to present a few more facts that I failed to include in the first video. This is an attempt to further stress my point of there being Moors of all shades, which should be apparent in the fact that North Africa has always been a crossroads of civilizations, with peoples from all three continents of the Old World having empires in the region at various points throughout history.
This is very sneaky. The Abyssinian people conquered Yemen, so that's an African population conquering Arabia. The Greeks once conquered the Middle East. This is a European conquering of the Middle East. And then obviously there was the Khanites who conquered part of the Middle East. This is 4 different populations who existed in that region as different groups of people. So does that not mean that the Middle East too should suffer the consequences of what you are saying right now? But even more than this, there stands another thing. The Indo-Europeans who were early, the Iranians that moved around, you have the Turks who moved around, you have all these other groups that existed and the migrations back and forth in that area.
One of the most famous and notable Moor states was founded in the 11th century and was known as the Almoravid dynasty. This fearsome empire began in what is now modern-day Morocco and expanded south of the Sahara, temporarily conquering the Soninke Empire of Ghana in the year 1076. As we know, the majority of the Moroccan population are of Berber, or more properly, Amazigh ancestry. Amazigh are not the same as Arabs or sub-Saharan African blacks.
This is where he loses me. Clearly, the Amazigh people are closer related to Middle Eastern type than they are to sub-Saharan Africans, and they're closer related to Middle Eastern types than they are to Europeans. So the Amazigh people who exist today are in fact Middle Eastern types. Saying that they are different than Arabs because they have different languages or whatever is not the same thing. That's like saying that the Congolese people are different than the Niger people because they have a completely different language group and some genetics are different.
We'll touch on that more later though. The Soninke people of the Ghana Empire are undeniably what we'd refer to as black people here in the West, phenotypically speaking, or sub-Saharan African. Roughly a decade later, in the year 1086, the Almoravid army famously crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and went on to conquer most of the Iberian Peninsula, or what we know today as the countries of Spain and Portugal. This peninsula is inhabited by people that we refer to as white people. So moving back to the conquest of Ghana, the Almoravids became allies of the Kingdom of Takrir, a small state that existed in what is now modern-day Senegal, another undeniably black African kingdom that bordered the Empire of Ghana to the west. Both the Almoravids and the Takriri were Islamic states, while Ghana was not. Ghana had been a long-time rival of the Kingdom of Takrir, and the latter did not hesitate to form an alliance with their more powerful fellow Muslim neighbors to the north.
Perspective to this, let's read another part where Pliny talks about Ethiopians in the northern part of Africa. The river Senesis, the nation of Selextia, and Masati, the rivers Masatal and Darat, wherein crocodiles are produced, then a bay of 516 miles enclosed within the promontory of the mountain Bars, running out into the west, which is called Serentium. After it, the river pulses, beyond which are the Ethiopian Perosi, and at their back are the Pharisee, upon whom joined the inland people, the Gaetoli Dera. But upon the coast are the Ethiopian Deratite, the river Bombatus, full of crocodiles and hippopotamus. So as you can see here, the area that is considered today Berber territory is actually back then considered to be native to the Perosi. And as you can see here, how the experts break it down, Plinius wrote that the area north of the river Senegal was populated during Augustus' time by the Pharisee and Perosi. Berbers moved south to Mauritania beginning the 3rd centuries, followed by Arabs in the 8th century, subjugating and assimilating Mauritanians' original inhabitants. Here you go, people. You have a ancient person who lived at the time saying that the Berbers came in the 3rd century, replacing the native population. Remember when people said, hey, where's the replacement? How come there's no writing about the replacement? Well, here you go. And that's it, right? We're done here. So we can move on and read another statement by Plinius. The Mori, which in time past was the principal and of whom the province took its name, and those most writers have called Maurici, being by war weakened, they wasted to a few families. Next to them were the Mososeli, but in like manner they were extinguished. Now are the nations inhabited by Gaetoli, Beneri, and Otololes, the most powerful of all, a part of whom were once the Vesuni, but being divided from them, they became a nation by themselves, and were turned to Ethiopians. This province being full of mountains, eastward elephants. Okay, so again, you see more writing about the Mori, the Moors. This Mori word is the Moors. And remember, I read to you Herodotus and the other person saying that the word Moor comes from the skin color of the people. People say we don't know where the word Moor comes from. We do know it's written down by the ancients. They say that it comes from the skin color of the people. And what skin color are the people of Mauritania? Well, according to Plinius, the skin color is Ethiopian, the black Ethiopians. And as you can see here, he says that the Gaetoli, the Benere, and the Atolilis overpowered the original Mori, and then the original Mori, and then the Gaetoli, Benere, and Atobilis, who were the most powerful nations by themselves, and were turned into Ethiopians. So those nations were then turned into Ethiopians. So according to this guy, by this time, the province of Tanya, which you will see is in North Africa, the people during his time were turned into Ethiopians. So they start off as Moors, they move on to Gaetoli, Benuri, and Atotalians, and then they move back to being Ethiopians. That is the history. So if you're wondering who these Gaetuli people are who conquered the original Mauritanians, the Gaetuli who replaced the Mauritanians who were there before them, as you can read on Wikipedia, Gaetuli was a Romanized name of an ancient Berber tribe inhabiting Gaetuli. The latter district covered the large desert region south of the Atlas Mountains bordering the Sahara. Now listen to this part, which some guy just added for no reason. Other documents place Gaetuli in pre-Roman times along the Mediterranean coasts of what is now Algeria and Tunisia and north of the Atlas. Now, you notice how he didn't put any documents, and even the reference points says which, meaning which documents are you talking about state this. Instead, they put the document that I just put, continuing, so let's continue. Algeria and Tunisia and north of the Atlas. During the Roman period, according to Pliny the Elder, the Otololos, Gaetuli, established themselves south of the province of Mauritania Tangita in modern-day Morocco. The name of Godola people is hypothesized to be derived from the word Gaetuli. So the Berber seem to be a nation that comes after the Mauritanians, and they come later, and then, as you read there, they were turned into Ethiopia.
So now that we have all the context out of the way, these Black Takruri allies of the Almoravid Empire are known to have supplied 4,000 troops to take part in the conquest of Spain.
Pliny book is from 79 AD, whereas you consider that the invasion of Spain was in 711 AD. And of course, this invasion was not done by Arabs. It was done by Arabs mixed with populations that they got from other places in order to invade. And just like they did in Egypt, just like they did in North Africa, and they did in Spain, they did this using populations that they had assimilated into their groups. And so some of those assimilated groups were black people, like the ones he just mentioned. He said there was 4,000, but the Mauritanians would have been Ethiopian, at least for a while.
By the way, the sources for all of this will be cited on my website and Patreon, as usual. With that being said, all written documents describing how black the Moors were can easily be explained by instances such as this one, as an army of 4,000 black troops would be quite the sight to behold among a group of people who likely never encountered many, if any, black people in their entire lives. It's also quite easy to understand why they'd have seen these warriors as members of the Almoravid dynasty despite hailing from a different country, much farther away. In any case, however, the Takruri and the Almoravids were both Moors, regardless of any superficial racial differences, as I so eloquently stated in my previous video. Moor means dark and refers to any African Muslim, regardless if they are black or brown. They were very dark in color compared to Europeans. Another testament to the existence of peoples with undeniable blackness, who are referred to as Moors, can be found in this excerpt in Richard Eden's account of Wyndham's voyages to Guinea that took place back in the year 1555. The king, who being black Moor, sat in a great huge hall, long and wide, the walls made of earth without windows, the roof of thin boards, open in sundry places, like unto lovers to let in the air. And here to speak of great reverence they give to their king. It is such that if we would give as much to our Savior Christ, we should remove from our heads many plagues which we daily deserve for our contempt and impiety. So it is, therefore, that when his noblemen are in his presence, they never look him in the face, but sit in cowering, as we upon our knees. So they upon their buttocks, with their elbows upon their knees and their hands before their faces, not looking up until the king command them. As you notice as well, he referred to the king specifically as a black Moor, which in and of itself debunks any solidarity to the racial identity of Moors collectively. The need to specify his blackness not only indicates that there were indeed black Moors, but it also shows that not all Moors were black. Otherwise, what's the point of saying black Moor? That would be no different than saying white Scandinavian.
This is where I have to jump in, because there's something very important here that's being missed. First of all, this is written in 1500s, meaning that this is way beyond the first invasion of the Moors, of these being the ones written down. And even Renaissance art is way later compared to when the Moors first took over in the 700s. Obviously, the Moors stayed, and clearly, as he shows, there were black Moors. But here's the thing that makes it even worse. There are accounts of black people ruling this region, and I will read them. What we are talking about now is the 8th century, and by this century, or the 9th century, by this century, there's a person called Idris I and Idris II. Idris I started the Idrisian dynasty, and listen to what a author who lived at the time had to say in a book called The Meadows of Gold. This account was written in 900 AD, which, keep in mind, this is 200 years after the invasion of Spain. The account which are reported respecting the sea of the West are marvelous, particularly those which regard the sea that washes the cultivated districts of Sudan Negroes and the extreme West. Men who are possessed of an extensive knowledge of our globe say that the Abyssinians and Sudan occupy a country of 7 years' journey, that Egypt forms the 6th part of the country of Sudan, and that the country of Sudan forms only a small portion of the surface of the earth, the dimensions of which is 500 years' journey. 1/3 of it is inhabited, 1/3 is desert, and 1/3 is covered with seas. The country of the Sudan borders on the most distant plains of the dominions of Idris ben Abdullah ben El-Hassan ben El-Hussein ben Ali ben Abi Taleb in the Maghreb, which is a country of Tilimsan, Tahat, and Fez.
Or Native American Aztec. The need to specify that he's a black Moor is a clear indicator that black people were not the only Moors. So this excerpt alone would be enough to finish this video, but there are also many more elements to cover. So another common argument I get to attest to the blackness of Moors is that the modern inhabitants of North Africa are Arabs that displaced or mixed with the original black inhabitants after the Islamic invasions.
I showed you an earlier study, and these were the results. In order to test the contributions of Berbers to the general structure of Morocco, we conducted several AMOVA collections. Comparisons between the Moroccan Berber and Arab speaking samples failed to show any significant difference between them among groups 0 versus that within groups equal 14.8%. The same trend was observed when Tunisian Berber and Arab speaking samples were compared, so the AMOVA results underlined the lack of a clear pattern of grouping for either geography, Morocco versus Tunisia, or language, Berber versus Arab speaking, among North African groups, indicating that no geographical or linguistic homogeneous groups could be differentiated using Y chromosome STR polymorphism. These results suggesting considerable population heterogeneity in North Africa agree with other studies based on mitochondrial and autosomal data. New Y chromosome STR analysis in North African samples focusing on not only their countries of origin but also other anthropological well-defined characteristics like language and ethnicity will increase the utility of these polymorphisms both for forensic and anthropology purposes. So basically, this is saying that these people are not one group, but instead seem to be developed from multiple groups of people.
As mentioned earlier, Amazigh and Arabs are not the same people. They have different languages, cultures, and even different writing systems. And only
if you take this example to heart, then you could find out that people from India are both not then from the same culture, because they might not share the same language and they might not share the same writing style. And even their culture could be vastly different from each other. Does that mean that they're both not Indian?
began to practice the same religion after the Arab invasions in the 7th and 8th centuries. Ibn Battuta, for example, was a Moorish explorer from Morocco from the 14th century. He was a Muslim who spoke Arabic, but he was neither an Arab or a sub-Saharan African. He was a Moor of Amazigh ancestry. After the Muslim invasions of North Africa, the Amazighs effectively became culturally Arabized but still genetically Amazigh. People of North Africa have been generally lighter skinned than sub-Saharan Africans and darker skinned than Europeans since long before the Arab invasion. The earliest archaeological evidence of Amazigh presence in North Africa dates back to roughly 12,000 years ago.
I'd love to know what that evidence is.
Long before humans even had the slightest concept of Arabs or Islam. These people primarily inhabited the Mediterranean coast of Africa, notably Morocco, Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia.
According to the ancient Romans, Libya was dominated by the Garamantes.
Even the Guanches, the indigenous peoples of the Canary Islands, were a light-skinned complexion and were both genetically and linguistically similar to Amazigh people, despite being isolated from the mainland for thousands of years. So much so that they were still using stone and wooden tools when the Spanish first arrived on the islands in the 15th century.
The people from the Canary Islands are thought to have taken the same route that the people in Crete and other Middle Eastern populations took in order to get to Europe, so it would have been around the other way, not through Africa. The African population that was found there could have just used more boats.
This should make sense as there is a natural gradient in skin color depending on proximity to equator. This trend is more pronounced in the Old World but is still present in the New World to some extent. While it is true that there were so-called black populations in parts of the Sahara Desert in the past, there are a few things to consider. Firstly, the Sahara was once a much wetter place in a period known as the Green Sahara. Several large inland seas covered this vast area, which was primarily composed of grasslands and savanna. This is confirmed by archaeological evidence including cave paintings found deep in the heart of the Sahara Desert, depicting large herds of animals and human populations that simply could not exist there today. and large subterranean aquifers found in those respective regions are all that remain of these ancient seas. As these grasslands receded, so did human populations, with many black populations migrating south to the river Niger, Lake Chad, and east to the Nile Valley as a result of these increasingly arid conditions.
It's funny because DNA from Niger Congolese people has been found in those places, this proving that there might have been Niger Congolese people living in those areas who migrated downwards.
Those indigenous Amazigh remained in their northerly Mediterranean homes without any need to leave, since the climate remained wet enough for continuous human habitation, and still does today. Those of the desert simply retained a nomadic lifestyle, moving in and out of areas formerly occupied by phenotypically black Africans. On the southern fringes of the Sahara, mixing did indeed occur in some populations, such as the case with the Tuareg, who can be phenotypically identical to sub-Saharan Africans, Amazighs, and everything between.
Like most historians say from back then, the majority population of Libya was the Garamantes, and the Garamantes dominated Libya and were an Ethiopian population, according to the ancient Greeks and Romans.
However, it is simply nonsensical to think that a few Arab armies can go to a land area larger than the entire United States and can replace nearly every single black person with their own.
Not according to the study that I just read, and on top of that, America did do just that. Didn't they replace the entire population of the entire continent of America in less than, 600 years?
Mixing most certainly did happen. It is not an explanation as to why North Africa.
It's funny because he's given some solutions to these problems. One, even the people that he calls Berbers, if they came 10,000 years ago, that's still proof that replacement can happen in short amounts of time. And secondly, he's got this idea that the only thing that can kill you is people. Well, there was also the Black Plague that killed a ton of people in Africa, and especially North Africa. That could have taken care of some of the people. Lastly, there are multiple nations where the populations evolved in short amounts of time, just like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. A lot of places that were invaded by the Mongols changed their population quite quickly, stunningly, in fact. What about the fact that a huge amount of genetics in China comes from a single development in gene from the Mongol period? What about the fact that Egyptians suddenly just collapse out of nowhere and have tons of people moving in from time to time? Not to mention the people that would have come in and out once the area had been basically ransacked. And also, it would have been a road to Spain. Since their territory was in Spain, they would have used this area as a road. So there would have been multiple people coming in and out of this region. North Africa was known to be one of their territories, so they used it as a hub. So it was not just a few armies, it was also tons of people for hundreds of years moving back and forth, including black African slaves. If you want to know a population that replaced people in a short amount of time, what about the millions of people, black African slaves like the Zanj, who live in Yemen, who live in Iraq, who live in Saudi Arabia? What about those people? Also, what about the Bantu migration that seems to happen very quickly and dominates this small region of Africa, or this large region of Africa? That happens in a very small amount of time too.
Africans aren't black, especially considering that darker skin is a dominant gene. In other words, the people would be darker if they had mixed with sub-Saharan Africans.
Given that the black side of the gene is somewhere between 2 to 3%, in a lot of them ranging up to like 12%. I wouldn't expect them to be that dark.
This can be observed in populations farther to the south like the aforementioned Tuareg nomads. This is also seen in Egyptian populations, both modern and ancient. Mixing did occur in some places as climate continued to dry, as it never stopped drying and still continues to do so today. Various populations converged in the fertile green Niger and Nile river systems. However, the modern inhabitants of North Africa are not collectively a product of mixing.
In every sense of the word, they are collectively a product of mixing. And the fact that the Arab speakers in the Berber populations or the North African populations have virtually no distinction to the Berber populations or the people who consider themselves Berber, and the fact that their DNA is more heterogeneous than it is homogeneous, which is what you would expect if the populations had been there for an exceedingly long time, especially since they were nomadic, then we can conclude that these people have had a touch of modern DNA, even if you don't accept the idea that they were black. There was a large amount of Arabs coming in and mixing with these people. That's why almost everybody who lives in North Africa has Arab DNA. And how many of the people who live by the other side, close to Spain, how many of them have like 20% European DNA? They have like large amounts of DNA that has to do with European.
Last major inconsistency with this mixing theory is that nobody ever mentions the Romans. Romans held territories in North Africa for several centuries. If Arabs supposedly had such a tremendous influence on the North African gene pool, why didn't the Romans?
Well, firstly, we don't know if the Romans didn't have a genetic effect on the people. And then secondly, the people have a elevated European DNA in North Africa, especially the side that faces the Spain area. And the people of Spain have an elevated Iberian DNA, which confuses which side they got it from. Did they get it from the Romans or did they get it from the Spaniards?
Today I'm doing something that I've wanted to do for a really long time. Take a DNA test and see my results. Ooh, this is so spot on. That's freaky. I'm 85% North African and Arabian. Yeah. Guess I'm not adopted. 0.5% Western Asian, 1% broadly Western Asian and North African. Yo, I'm 1.5% Asian. Literally everything just says you're actually Moroccan, by the way. Surprise! 10% European. Bish, where? Specifically Southern European. Spanish and Portuguese. That's so cool! What the heck?
The Almoravids that many radical Afrocentrics claim to have been black invaded Spain several centuries after Rome had conquered it, so how would it be possible for their populations to have remained purely black African in phenotype after being under Roman control for so long? Why would things change so suddenly when Arabs arrived, but not with the Romans? In conclusion, Moors are not black, nor are they white, nor are they Arabs. Moors are just Moors. They're not an ethnic group or a linguistic group. They're not one unified people. They're not a particular race or a particular nationality. They have no specific homeland or unified state, and they never have. Moor is nothing more, no pun intended, than just a blanket term for North Africans or African Muslims in a general sense. Nothing more, still no pun intended, nothing less. The word Moor denotes a dark complexion which could be brown, tawny, or black in color, all of which are indeed dark in comparison to any European, and the word Moor derives from the languages of the European continent. Despite the fact that I was very clear and concise and backed up everything I have with sources, references, and even direct quotes, confirmation bias is a very powerful thing, especially when it involves race. But at the very least, for the majority of you watching who are level-headed and open-minded, I hope that this follow-up provided some clarity to the mysterious Moorish people. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe if you want more videos like these.
The word Moor did mean more than just people who are Moor DNA, because at first it meant the Moorish people of North Africa, but then, due to the association with the Islamic expansion in Spain, they started referring to people of just about any race as long as they converted to Islam to Moors. That's why you find later on people saying that white Moors when they talk about North Africans, and then they say black Moors when they talk about the Zanj, which the Zanj were never Moors ever, but because this word started meaning anyone who is Muslim, that's when this word started taking hold as a different word. This is different than the Moors that you see back in the day being referred to by the Greeks and the Romans. Later on, this word took a life of its own. And of course, today it's returned to its original meaning, but a lot of people are still playing with the word like this video did.